Hi, I'm Mark Kramer. I'm a founder and managing director of the global social impact consulting firm FSG, and also a faculty member of Harvard Business School. And I'm delighted to be attending the Karma Summit and helping Godera create this remarkable global event. And I am thrilled to be on a panel with three distinguished panelists. I will let each of them introduce themselves a little more fully when they first begin speaking. But we have Varsha Rao, who is the CEO of the healthcare startup Nurx. We have Shripriya Mahesh, who is the founder of Spero Ventures. And we have Sheldrick, who is the global director for policy advocacy of a really interesting organization called Global Citizen. So I want to go around, and I'll start with Shripriya. And I want to start out by talking about the situation that the world is in today with this triple catastrophe of the pandemic, the economic collapse that has caused, and of course, the emerging awareness of racial injustice and how both the pandemic and the economic disaster have had a hugely disproportionate impact on people of color in the United States and underserved populations throughout the world. Our hope, of course, is that we can learn something from this catastrophe, and that when we recover, we will not go back to the normal that used to be, but we will go back to a new normal that is hopefully a much better one. So that's what I want to start off asking our panelists to talk about. Do you think we can achieve a new and different normal as this pandemic ends? And what would that look like? So Shripriya, let me start with you.
Thanks, Mark. I'm really happy to be here as well. Thanks for that easy first question and very small in scope as well. But no, I do think, I feel like these three things have, if anything, amplified and brought attention to the problems that we're facing. All of these problems, that we were on the cusp of our economy not doing well, the racial issues that have existed for centuries have all been brought to light because of the situation we're in right now. And if you look at it, I'm a venture investor, so I have to be optimistic. And so I choose to look at what does this do for us on the positive side, And I'm hopeful that COVID will show us that our health systems are horribly broken, that they have no support and they let down the most needy citizens amongst us, that it also shows us at how quickly the earth can recover. You look at some things that we've been seeing in the news on, there being more bees, or like the birds are out more, or whatever it is. And, areas that were covered in pollution are starting to recover. We need to pay attention to this. And we were so busy living our lives, and COVID has forced us to stop and pay attention to that. Right. So I think air pollution, for example, is hugely tied to how affected people are by COVID, how susceptible they are, and their recovery rates. And I'm hoping that it'll make us focus on that, and not just air pollution, but all the things we do to our world for the sake of very short-term profits. And then finally, on the racial inequities, I've been in the US since '95, actually, when I came to Boston to go to business school. And in the past 25 years that I've been here, I haven't really seen things change dramatically. There's a lot of talk, but incidences keep happening. And I'm really hopeful, because of the fact that we are all locked away at home. This time does feel different. I've said that before, for sure, but it does feel like we're in a moment in time where people are recognizing that, hey, we're all human beings. We need to make sure every citizen has equal rights. And I think we're looking at capitalism and re-looking at capitalism, right? And saying, what does it really mean? How far do we have to go? I was trained to be a capitalist. I am a capitalist, but I do feel like sometimes capitalism goes a little too far, and we need some adjustment to our system to make it more fair for everybody. And so, that's the lens with which I look at the world. And that's how we think about investing as well, in terms of how do we invest in companies that can make the world better when they get to scale, right? And I feel like we're just a small firm, but I think more people are thinking about the world like that. Varsha's company, who I met several years ago when they were raising their seed, is in that mold. If Nurx gets to scale, it will actually make the world better. It'll increase accessibility. And so I think that we potentially all have more time to think. We're definitely not in bubbles we used to. We are, sitting in our own individual bubbles. And I'm very hopeful that the three issues that you raised will be better after this, and that we will all kind of take them on with new energy.
I certainly hope you're right. That's optimistic and very hopeful. Varsha, what do you think? You want to bring us back to reality or stay with the optimism?
I think, well, first of all, thank you for, it's a pleasure to be here today and really an honor. And Shripriya, thank you for mentioning kind of a little bit of the work that we are doing at Nurx. Our mission is really all about reimagining access to healthcare. And as Shripriya said, I think before the pandemic, it was really clear to a lot of people that our healthcare system was incredibly broken. But I think, the pandemic has really pushed our healthcare system to the brink. And so what I am hopeful about is that in this period of almost desperation, we've had to innovate and be really creative in order to still make sure people are getting access to essential services, and life can try to go on as good as it could possibly be. And so I think, for example, we are a telehealth company and we provide access to contraception, HIV prevention through PrEP, STI testing, a lot of these services that we call sensitive health issues. And telehealth has been, in the shadows, I think, a little bit until now, in terms of perception, trust, and yet it's incredibly, it really helps to increase access. So for example, 40% of our patients actually come from the South. And, we are actually 19 million women live in contraception deserts. And so our whole mission has been around increasing access. And so I think one thing that's come out of this is that more people are actually using telehealth as a first place to access the healthcare system. And I think that really is a positive. We've actually seen requests for birth control increase by about 50% on our platform since the pandemic began. And so I think that's one aspect that's really potentially a positive, that you have maybe a decade's worth of acceptance and innovation happening a lot quicker. Providers are a lot more receptive to using telehealth. Insurance companies are more willing to reimburse for it, which is honestly an incredible, important part. And then patients are also more trusting. So, I think that's a potential positive. I think for us, another piece, we feel really grateful that we are part of a mission-driven company. That's everything that Nurx is about. And so when everything was happening and has been happening around racial injustice, we've had really open discussions in our company about how people have been really in pain. And based on what's going on in their outside environment, this has added anxiety to what's already an anxious time. And so I think it also highlights the fact that, and our company has really come together. We are really starting with education and open sharing discussions, some of which are incredibly painful, honest and heartbreaking, to be honest, but really important for people to really understand the nature of the challenges that many of our teammates are facing. And so I think it's the beginning of then what we can do as leaders to actually bring change and make change happen faster. So that's my hope, is that the pandemic and the environment that we're in right now forces change to happen faster than what we might otherwise see, because, you know, I don't want to see another generation of people be set back or held back from their potential. And I think we have the power as leaders to actually try to accelerate that change. So I'm sure we can talk more about it, but those are just a couple of reasons why I'm, you know, cautiously optimistic despite everything going on.
And Mick, and do say a word about what Global Citizen is as well as you start.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. And again, it's a privilege to be on this panel. Global Citizen, we're a movement of millions of activists around the world campaigning for a world without extreme poverty. We're most well known for our pop and policy approach, and perhaps some of our recent events this year, including the One World Together at Home, which was seen, you know, around the world in support of frontline health workers. But look, in answer to your question, you know, my view is you know, crises ultimately, when the history books are written about them, are often remembered for as much as how they end, and are resolved for as much as how they begin. And you know, the jury is still out, of course, how this will all end when we look at, say, this pandemic. But you know, my view is it has the opportunity, if the world did the right thing, to actually be a blueprint. And the reason why I say that, you know, this week, some of you might have seen the reports around the vaccines in Oxford and others gaining momentum. But the real question isn't about, you know, whether a vaccine will be developed or not, but how we will ensure that this is actually equitably distributed, because the world just doesn't have the manufacturing capacity to produce 7 billion vaccines all at once. So the question is who is going to get it first? And we could, I guess, succumb to what we've called vaccine nationalism, and it could all be bought up and go to the wealthiest regardless of need. Or you could actually say, you know, this is going to go to health workers on the front lines. It's going to go to those who are most vulnerable, such as those aged 65 or above, or showing other health issues that might make them more susceptible to the virus. You know, this equitable distribution that requires all of countries to come together and figure out, okay, how do we actually do this in terms of what is fair? And the reason why that could be a blueprint is, you know, even before COVID-19 happened and it's exposing many of the inequalities that existed, you know, we've long campaigned in support of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which is the world's blueprint to end extreme poverty, mitigate climate change, and reduce inequality. And we were nowhere near on track. And at their core, it's really about leaving no one behind, and equity being at its core. So I like to think that maybe if we could resolve this in the right way, it could actually be a blueprint to kick off a decade of action and actually show the way, you know, we're all connected, no one's safe until everyone's safe. And how do we do what's fair? Not just what equality, because equality implies sameness. I'm a healthy, young 32-year-old male. You know, it's unfair for me to get a vaccine before a health worker or someone aged older, you know, so it's not about necessarily equality, sameness. It's about what is equitably the right thing to do and what is fair. And so that's where I think there could be a way forward. To your question, you know, there's a lot of work to be done though towards to us to get to that point. We will see, and it will require people to look beyond their self-interest over the coming months and year ahead.
Well, you know, that's great. And this idea of looking beyond people's self-interest is not something investors are known to do, at least not often. You know, it's easy to understand how something like Zoom or telehealth at Nurx is getting a huge lift from the circumstances we're living in at the moment. But when you think about things like racial justice or stakeholder capitalism, as being called now, the idea that companies have an obligation to look out for the welfare of all stakeholders, not just maximize investor returns. Do you see companies actually beginning to do that? Or do you think it's just a lot of talk? And let me go back to you, Shripriya.
I do, Mark. And I think, you know, fundamentally, you have to think about it as what's better for the company. And these things are actually all better for the company. If you have diverse points of view and your organization looks like the world that you inhabit, it's better for you because you will hear things and you will get perspectives that you wouldn't otherwise get if you stayed in your little bubble of, perhaps where you grew up or where you went to school. And so I think companies are seeing that more and more. The other thing is, in terms of, stakeholder capitalism, if it's the same pie, then, I think, yes, people could be fighting over like, oh, this is a zero-sum game. But in reality, if people fundamentally believe that stakeholder capitalism leads to a much bigger pie, because every person there is thinking about it as their own company. And even if you go back to self-interest, right? If they're self-interested and they want to make this bigger, the pie is actually going to end up much bigger. And I feel that's the fundamental shift we need to make, right? Which is by everyone being better, like you yourself are better. And we're seeing that right now with COVID. It's such a sharp point. If you ignore the weakest amongst us, it's going to come back and hurt you in very bad ways. So just disregarding, like the bottom segment of society just is silly, because really we live in a very interconnected world. And even globally, the nationalists among us, I'm like, how can you possibly be so closed? Because, this virus, if it's just outside our borders, we can't keep it that way forever. So there is something to like a rising tide lifting all boats. And I'm hoping that people see the world that way, which will then encourage people to share.
Yep. No, and I completely agree. I do see that shift happening. Michael Porter at Harvard and I wrote this article a number of years ago on creating shared value. And the idea is exactly that when companies create value for society, they actually create more value for themselves. And we do see this in practice. We see examples when Walmart provides better training for entry-level employees, raises their wages, provides healthcare benefits, and so on. The increase in productivity is dramatic and far offsets the cost. But it is still hard, I have to say, to get companies to think about doing good as a better way of doing business and not as something they do on the side for philanthropy. So that's the challenge.
My view on companies is a bit more narrow, because I think of companies as more Silicon Valley and tech companies, and so in Silicon Valley and tech, which, where they have more power than we used to 15 years ago, and it's dramatically increased. I do see these conversations. I'm not so sure about, more traditional mainstream companies. But I will say in Silicon Valley, there's a huge focus on, and sharing equity started from that perspective, right? Hey, if you shared equity, everyone would be more incented or, have more incentive to grow the pie. And so I feel that strain, if we can continue that to other things, could be very helpful. But on the mainstream, I'm just less exposed to them, and it may be a different world. I'm not sure.
Okay. Varsha, what are your thoughts?
I think, what I think is that more than anything, employees and even your end users are requiring a shift in terms of what is important. Maybe that's how I would say it. People want to be, even prior to the pandemic, I would say people were moving towards mission-oriented companies and in companies that really had something authentic to believe in and in their approach. And I truly believe after this, whenever this ends, we will have gone through probably the most harrowing experience that and it'll have been a common collective experience. I think it's moved us faster and more decidedly into a place where mission and authenticity are important. And so I really don't think it's a choice. I think if you want to keep your employees engaged, you must listen, and you must not just listen, but act and respond, because it's truly about many people feeling safe, many people feeling heard, and just a stronger, real collective understanding that things are not exactly as many people have imagined, you know?
Yeah.
And I think that it's easier to hear it from your employees if you're listening, but your customers and in our case, our patients, they're also saying and feeling the same things. And so it's just, you know, it's upon us as leaders to really actually drive change in these areas. It's really not a choice. I don't view it as Shripriya is saying, is like, I don't view it as a fixed pie. I do think our whole thought is, you know, we want people to be able to feel like they can bring their best selves and their authentic selves to work. And if they do that, there's no question that what gets delivered, so to speak, or what comes out of that is much greater than would otherwise be offered. So the pie is never going to be the same. And that's why we feel so strongly, and I feel so strongly about this. It's really not a choice.
Absolutely. Nick, what are you hearing from all these volunteers?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. You know, one of the biggest, I guess, types of companies that we've been working with in recent months, picking up from what I was talking about as vaccines, is obviously the pharmaceutical industry, right? And I think there is a recognition that if they were to pursue profit over people, and, you know, once vaccines are developed, sell to the highest bidder, that certainly wouldn't be good for their reputation. And so I think there is an awareness around a broader, you know, stakeholder ecosystem. I think long gone are the days when several decades ago, you know, drugs were first developed against HIV/AIDS, and the pharmaceutical industry, you know, quite shockingly, you know, sold them at high prices to those who couldn't afford them. You know, now there's a whole lot of pressure not to do that, to be seen as a responsible stakeholder. And so, you know, when I look at people like Dr. Paul Stoffels, the Chief Scientific Officer of Johnson & Johnson, you know, he's been very vocal about the need that this is a vaccine, once developed, is distributed equitably. I think the challenge and a big limitation for a lot of these companies is the rules in which they operate, you know, often set by governments and others. You know, a company in America that develops a vaccine may want to subscribe to principles of equitable access. But if they're receiving US government funding and, you know, things like the Defense Production Act or other mechanisms are invoked, you know, they may be ordered to do something that they don't want to do. And in that respect, I think, you know, when we look at stakeholder engagement, you know, this whole concept of the corporate as an activist is really important to actually shape government policy in favor of, you know, many of these values we're talking about. You know, I think, you know, in another aspect of our campaign, we're currently looking at the role private creditors are playing with respect to developing countries. And one of the biggest things that they can do is suspend or even reduce the amount of debt or debt repayments developing countries owe private lenders. And last week, you know, I was asked to sign or co-sign a letter by the International Chamber of Commerce to private lenders and you know, the G20 finance ministers. So I think, you know, there are examples of this sort of corporate activism out there. And, you know, you talk about stakeholder capitalism, it's seeing more and more of that, because if our political leaders won't lead, then we need business leaders certainly too.
Absolutely. And, you know, part of the idea of looking out for stakeholders is the idea of listening to them. And there's a lot of talk now about sharing power and really listening to the people who we're trying to help, or the people who are our customers, the people who are our suppliers, our employees. And yet sharing power is not easily done. I'm curious if you're seeing examples of where that's actually happening and what it looks like. And we don't have to go in the same order all the time, so anyone can jump in.
Well, you know, maybe I'll just jump in. You know, I think for me, in some of these areas, it actually started when we made the decision to go remote. I would say that was like there's been a lot of leadership challenges, I would say, for leaders this year based on everything. And, that was one of the first times, we've not been remote historically. And so this was a very new change. And so it was a lot about listening to, we made the decision to go remote. We're actually remote till the end of the year for 80% of our staff. But it's also been a lot about consistent listening to understand how our employees are doing in this environment. So we have been doing pulse surveys every month to understand what are the challenges that people have with working from home, and to understand, and we do it in all hands every 2 weeks, and we are always welcoming feedback. We have an open chat. Our culture is very transparent, and it's enabled people to really share what they feel. But we also use tools like Slido where people can ask anonymous questions, and we welcome them and we answer every single one, no matter what it says. So I think, yeah, there's some that are uncomfortable. There are some that are, critical, but we typically answer every single one of them because that's how we build trust. And, I think what we've found over this time that there are challenges, like work from home has had its positives, it has its negatives, but we were able to institute a $500 stipend, for example, to make it easier for people to set up their home offices because people have different circumstances. We've been able to think through, different methods of making, one of the reasons why we're excited about Goodera's virtual volunteering solution is because we are finding that as much people do miss engagement. They really want to have an impact and they want to do it together. And so it's one of the reasons why we are excited about actually implementing the virtual volunteering solution that Goodera has, because people want ways to reach out and help even in this environment. And so I would say listening is pretty important. But I was inspired, truthfully, even early on with some of the letters that people, some of CEOs sent out to their staff, either about COVID, but also about, the police violence around George Floyd, and just taking that step even when it's not necessarily, it maybe feels uncomfortable. It feels potentially even scary as a leader to send an email out to all your employees where, you're not sure if you're going to say the right thing or not. I think what I've been consistently coached on from my own employees is that it's better to say something authentically than to not say anything. And that opens up the ability for other people to share. So I think it's leaders' jobs to kind of open and create that forum and then to sit back and listen, because a lot of the ideas are going to come from your own teams.
That's good advice.
I saw a couple of examples in our industry that were public, right? So one was Alexis Ohanian, who stepped off the board of Reddit, which she had co-founded, in order to let, a diverse, very talented person take his spot. And the other, more recently, last week was, or 2 weeks ago, was Fred Wilson, who talked about investors, especially white male investors who, dominate Silicon Valley, to not require board seats with their investments, but instead take a board observer seat and let the board seat be taken by an independent. I think that's a great suggestion for a couple of reasons. First, you're giving opportunity to people that would not have otherwise, right? And you're sharing that power. And second is the realization that board members actually can't change the trajectory of a company. And if you think about it from an investor versus an independent board member who's been a CEO before, that independent board member who's been a CEO before, gone through what that entrepreneur has gone through, is such a great fit on the board. So I've seen both of those things. And in our own efforts, as the most recent Black Lives Matter movement started, and we looked at ourselves and we said, yes, we're investing and we've set aside money to go even earlier to invest in founders, but we looked at our team and we said we could do something this summer. We're not huge fans of summer interns in the venture industry, or at least for us. And we said, but this is a unique opportunity. And 3 weeks later, we had 2 amazingly talented underrepresented summer interns. Now, the key learning for me is it wasn't the same amount of work as before. It was more work, right? Because we posted this job in organizations we weren't familiar with, but was very familiar to the underrepresented community. And so I think, this sense that we can just do the same thing and things will improve is not accurate. I think we all have to go out of our way and make the out of the way the norm in order to start sharing that, and being willing to be uncomfortable and being willing to, we had our associates during interview process say like, hey, why are you doing this? What's the racial makeup of your firm? And I was happy to tell them exactly why I was doing it and what it was. And we've already seen the impact that they've had, right? And so I think we all have to be willing to expand our worldview in order to create the environment that we want, even if it's uncomfortable.
Yeah, and a lot of it really is just making that shift and being willing to confront that discomfort and being intentional about behaving differently than just business as usual. Mick, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, we work with a number of companies, particularly this year with our Together at Home campaign, where you saw over $127 million pledged. The vast majority came from companies, and in our follow-up campaign a few weeks ago, Global Goal Unite for Our Future, equally a similar amount from companies was pledged towards the COVID-19 response. And one thing that was very clear early on is that a strong motivating factor for many of these companies was because of their employees. There was a feeling and pressure from their employees, not just that they wanted them to do CSR, but that they wanted them to speak up. And actually, it was interesting, speak up in support of global institutions like the WHO. I think there were a feeling amongst many that if the American government is withdrawing from the global response, perhaps American companies should be stepping up. And it was interesting because perhaps in the past, something like that, which might be seen as controversial, they might be spoken out of, do we really want to be pledging to the WHO the same week that the American government is withdrawing? And many of them said, yes, this is a statement we want to make. And what was interesting is, our second campaign, Global Goal Unite for Our Future, in particular looked at the disparities, including amongst communities of color, that the COVID-19 pandemic was playing into. And the number of tweets, I saw of employees saying they were very proud that their companies were making these commitments in a very public way, encouraging others to act, is important. So I think it's not just being seen to do something, it's being seen to stand for the right thing, and being vocal. And I think we've seen that both in the context of Black Lives Matter, but also in the context to the global response. And we're probably even seeing it now in the context of, wearing masks and why that's important. But I think it's very apparent that a lot of the pressure comes from employees. And, we deal not with just big consumer-facing brands who you would expect, because many of their consumers might overlap with our citizen following, of which tends to gear towards a millennial following. But, you also see it from the likes of Cisco, and Cisco is not necessarily a big consumer-facing brand, but they have a large employee base. And you can see that sense of engagement coming from within. So I think increasingly, again, you come back to stakeholder capitalism, not just about the shareholders, but recognizing your employees is a big part and a big stakeholder in your company. So, that's certainly been my observation over the last few months.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And, as we've all been saying, companies are beginning to do things differently. I'm curious if you're seeing new opportunities emerging, whether it's new startup opportunities that you might be looking at to invest in Shripriya, or new avenues that you hadn't thought of before in your work, Varsha, or new volunteering directions and opportunities. Are there some new ideas out there that are a result of what's happening at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, perhaps I could just say, you know, in our experience, we're an activist platform, right? And we're fortunate that a lot of our actions, you know, you can volunteer and you can earn points for in-person actions such as cleaning up plastic on a beach or other forms of volunteering. But a lot you can do actually at home, you know, on the app. You can download quizzes, you can send emails to local elected officials. And what I've certainly seen is, you know, companies actually embracing this form of volunteering through technology, even if it isn't necessarily traditional volunteering service delivery, even if it's a little bit more towards the political activism space, you know, actually encouraging their staff, you know, to download our app in effect means you're encouraging them to engage with local members of perhaps Congress or write to governments or other world leaders, or just educate yourself on the policies. So there's certainly been a desire to give staff, I guess, in lockdown, other ways by which they can engage, and not just tokenism, but actually meaningful actions that equate to you know, activism.
You know what?
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Varsha.
No, I was just saying that's very interesting. Go ahead.
Okay. So, you know, one of the things that we're noticing is not so much that these companies have existed for a while, right? But like if they were selling into larger corporations, that's what I'm seeing change. So for example, my first institutional investment back in 2015 was in a company called Jopwell. It came out of YC, and the reason I invested was I said, these founders are amazing. And also this should exist in the world, right? Like help diversify your workforce. And they focus on Black, Latinx, and the indigenous population. And you know what was disheartening over the years since we invested was some of the largest companies we all know would give them tiny amounts of money to check the box, but really not do very much. And you know, we had our founder summit last week, and I had Porter on there, the CEO, and he said he is really hopeful for the first time because he's seen this make a shift in people and go away from checking the box to really start caring. And that was really one of the most hopeful things I heard of last week, right? Because I was like, okay, finally, this company should exist. Every company should be their customer in trying to hire very talented people. And that is a shift that's another little data point in making me believe that this time is different. Varsha, I'll hand off to you.
Yeah, no, I've seen a couple of things happen. One is it's kind of this interesting intersection. The fact that many companies are working remotely right now is, I think, first of all, opened everybody's eyes, certainly my eyes, to how effective it can be to work remotely, despite some of the challenges. So it's actually also an opportunity for us to look across the country now to find talent that is more diverse. Whereas historically, you know, the running theme, if you know we're based in San Francisco, would be that it's very difficult because the population in San Francisco is not necessarily there. The numbers of folks that are Black and underrepresented in San Francisco are not necessarily as high. So especially in the engineering and the tech side, for example, but that's no longer a barrier. And in fact, I think that in and of itself allows us to bring in talent. And I've also heard from, you know, I am an angel investor, and I've invested in two companies founded by Black CEOs. And they've often said that many people, many Black folks that they know haven't wanted to move to San Francisco because of it not necessarily being as welcoming an environment. And so no longer do we have some of those barriers, because if someone is super talented at Georgia Tech and wants to live in Atlanta, that can work. So I think that's an interesting opportunity that every company should look for. And there's fewer excuses, and I think it's really a wonderful thing. I think the other thing I've heard is that historically, that diversity and inclusion and belonging are things that you think about when you're a larger company, and it's because you need more resources. And I'm actually I really want everybody to flip it on its head and say, the smaller the company you are, the earlier you should think about these issues, as early as you can, because when you have 10,000 employees, 20,000 employees, it's really hard to change your ratios. It's it's very difficult.
I'm teaching a course this year at HBS on companies with purpose and how purpose can lead strategy. And I'm just writing a case on PayPal. And it's really an interesting company that has embraced purpose, the idea of making finance and financial transactions available to everyone, everywhere at very low cost. And they have really embraced diversity in their workforce, in their executive team, on their board, at every level. And I said, how is this possible? I hear from everybody in Silicon Valley that the people with the training and talent just aren't there. And they said that's not true. You have to create a culture where there really is a sense of inclusiveness and people can feel comfortable, because otherwise people vote with their feet. And there are a lot of people who don't want to go to an environment that is still, dominant, male, white, competitive environment that is not truly inclusive, even if it's trying to become diverse. And so I think there's a lot to be said about building that into the culture of the company. And certainly at Shripriya, as you said earlier, they have gained a lot of insight into their customer base by hiring people who look like their customers and come from the background of their customers.
Yeah, I mean, Mark, I'll say a couple of things. I worked at eBay from 2001 to 2006, a long time ago. And I ended up running global product for eBay. And even though it was that long ago, we were 50% female. The product managers were 50% female. It was true in category management as well, the business side of it, and product marketing. And I think about it now where people are struggling with that, like just gender equality in tech. And I'm just so surprised. And the reason we were 50% is because our CEO was a woman. The person who ran all of tech ops, product and design was a woman. And then I ran product, right? So you just look up that chain, it was all women. And so we weren't even focused on gender diversity. It just so happened that it was 50% women because we just evaluated the best candidates. And if the best candidates are equally distributed, then we'll have equality, right? And so I think about that now, and what Varsha says is, I agree, I tell our CEOs that you can't start too early, because even when you're at 10 people, if you're hiring your first woman at 10 people, it's already too late. You have the woman's going to show up and be like, I'm surrounded by 10 guys. Same for race, right? And so I don't think you can start too early. And to your point, Mark, on purpose, the way we define ourselves at Spero Ventures is we invest in the things that make life worth living. So we invest in mission-driven founders who want to build a great company that can return both fantastic financial results as well as, make the world better at scale, right? And it shocks me that when we launched, people still thought that, oh, wait, so they're going to do something and then do this other thing off to the side. And I'm like, no, they're not doing this other thing off to the side. By their very function, they are making the world more equitable in some fashion, right? And I think of some of the great companies like eBay, where I kind of, grew up as a product manager, or WhatsApp, which democratized access to communication, or Tesla, which is making the world better. And some of the greatest companies of our generation both have been and will be those companies that can marry both financial and social and try to make things better.
And there's this odd sense that somehow they're in competition, but of course you can't have social impact unless you build a successful business that scales. And
exactly.
when you have scales, you can sustain the social impact in a way that's
exactly
very
right.
Well,
yeah,
I know
scale is just so important. Sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
No. I was just going to say we only have a few minutes left. Unfortunately, I could talk with this panel all evening. It's a delightful conversation. But of course, I want to bring it back to volunteering because that's what Goodera is all about and has really been an innovator in. And so they've asked me to ask you just to go around real quickly. And what are 3 words that come to mind when you think about volunteering? And Mick, I'm going to go to you because that's core to your business.
Well, I would say crucial, impactful, and exchange.
Varsha?
I would say engagement, community, and impact. I'm sorry to repeat your word, Mick, but
And Shripriya?
I would say specific, meaningful, and probably community.
That's wonderful. And as a moderator, I'll toss in 3 myself. I would say firsthand experience, and even though that's 3 words, I'm going to call it 1, and learning, and friendship, because I think a lot of people make friends through their volunteering work. Well, this has been a delightful conversation with 3 truly remarkable people who are doing great things in the world. I'm indebted to Goodera for having made this possible, and thank you all for joining us today.